that's neither here nor there. Yeah, no, we were just talking about, whatever you wanted to talk about. We were
Yeah,
talking about talking, so we can now start talking, or we can keep talking about talking.
yeah.
It'd be very meta if we kept talking about talking.
Well, I have a lot of questions just because you're much more well versed in the metamodernism thing, and I'm just kind of exploring it and kind of getting an idea of what's going on here.
Well, now that we're recording, and if people do see this, I will say, yeah, I really liked that video that you made on the with the metamodernism using music and stuff, and I thought that that was cool. I always like when I like seeing people, you know, make YouTube videos trying to explore that topic and use examples and everything. So I thought yours was a cool one
Yeah, thank you.
for
Was there
whatever that's
anything
worth.
was there anything that was like not quite right? Because I know I was kind of coming at it from somewhere that's almost entirely like removed from the grander conversation.
That's a good question. So I watched it, you know,
It was a while back,
gosh,
so I
it was yeah,
understand.
it was at least a week ago that I saw it. Um, I'm trying to think. Remind me a little bit because you talk about classical music and then you talk about what was your examples of modern music?
Modern music, I said, was the classical kind of movement of the
Oh,
intellectualizing
okay,
of
okay.
music. And
Right. And
then
then the traditional was like the old folk music and stuff. And like, yes, I track with that. That's right. And then when you got to postmodern, you talked about jazz and
I folk music as like
right.
another one, and
Yeah.
then a broader dancing music. And then
Right.
from then on, I went to like Nirvana as kind of the other end of this long stretch of
Uh-huh.
more the popular genre. What like
Right.
pop as a genre is one of these things.
Right. And then your metamodern music, I have to confess I wasn't familiar with the specific bands you mentioned, but just from the pictures they look they look pretty interesting and yeah, anyway, so I can't really speak to that but they just, from a superficial assessment seem to track. Like when metamodernism first started being talked about purely within cultural studies, people were talking about Devendra Banhart and some of the like freak folk and um maybe you could even throw in some of that early emo to the degree that it was sort of like earnest, but also like ironic. These are interesting conversations, people debating these sorts of things.
I saw somebody post a video and they were talking about the stages of people liking the band Creed.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
if it's ironic or if it's like post irony and all these
yeah,
things.
yeah. Paul Anleitner did stuff talking about Creed and comeback of Creed and all that. I'm not sure. I haven't talked to Paul in a little while to see if that's still stuff he's interested in. But yeah, and then there's multiple layers to all this stuff. The only thing, maybe something I'd throw into the postmodern example might be some of that more punk rock. When I think like when I really think postmodern music, I tend to think more like punk rock and like you already mentioned Nirvana, but Radiohead,
Mhm.
um, a lot of that either kind of up in your face, Rage Against the Machine kind of stuff, or just more like drippingly ironic sort of stuff, like Radiohead. Um,
Are you
but
familiar with Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds?
I'm familiar with Nick Cave. I've heard of
Okay.
Nick Cave. I've not heard Nick Cave, or if I have, I did not know that I was hearing Nick Cave. So
Okay.
Spotify is an interesting thing too because it's sort of changed at least how I've listened to music where I probably know a lot more contemporary music than I think I do, but I don't pay attention anymore to like, which is really sad actually. There's interesting ways how new media change how we relate to media. um and uh and for me Spotify has really shifted. I used to like, you used to go out and like buy CDs from particular artists and that was very intentional. And then with Napster, even, you download specific things that you're looking for. But now it's all like recommended. So things will just come on and I'll be like, oh, I like that. And I might add it to a playlist, but I won't even necessarily, unless there have been some bands that I found where just like there's so much good stuff from them that you have to take note. You can't not take note.
Mhm.
And so there have been a few things like that. Anyway, we don't have to talk about music. We also
I'll,
can. It's I'd also like to get a little bit of your context too. We've never connected before, so just
yeah.
like a give me the skinny on your story and you know.
Yeah, I can try to kind of condense everything down.
Hmm.
Um, so I grew up in a home where my mother was a English teacher and my father is a or was a minister for the Assemblies of God.
Oh, okay,
So
cool. Yep,
I was just
familiar with that.
a PK, just living my life. I was in Maryland for a good bit of that, growing up just outside of DC. So it was just you know,
How old are you? When were you born?
2000. Yeah,
Okay.
September. So um towards the end of that.
Yep.
And yeah, so grew up around there. We had a lot of our church was very diverse. We had several different congregations of different immigrant groups kind of
Hmm.
coming in, but then also groups that were attending our English speaking church as well. So lived there for about half my life. And around middle school, I moved across the country to Washington, to a much less diverse area. And so it was kind of a shock in some ways.
Hmm.
Um, but then, moving several different times, just kind of losing all your friends and all your connections, it was really difficult. So I
Hmm.
have really good family connection, but outside of that, it was really difficult. So I kind of fell into a nihilist kind of mode.
Hmm.
I remember a journal I had a journal entry I had written that I was convinced that all my teachers were lying to me,
Hmm.
that they would say something about the history and it wouldn't match up what was in the textbook, and
Hmm.
it was clear that there was a narrative that was trying to be shaped in front of me,
Hmm.
and I remember really resenting that, and my response was not to like let's correct this, but to be like if my teacher doesn't care about doing their job, I'm not going to care about doing mine. And so I had horrible grades after that. And they were already kind of trending downwards. But
What was the narrative that they were trying to push?
I remember it was a little bit about. Um, so there was a class we were taking called Analyzing Modern World. I don't remember the specifics, but it was a class about the Middle East and
Uh-huh.
Middle Eastern conflicts, and um, it was some stuff about like saying that this is what a particular group believes, but it didn't match up to like what the group says they believe. It was
Mm.
more of like trying to craft a narrative to make things look better than they or to
Yeah,
say
gotcha.
certain people are on the good side or the bad side.
Was this in like the wake of 9/11 and a lot of the Islamophobia stuff that was like kind of being reacted to? Was that sort of the
Yeah, I think I think it was like the back and forth. It was
Yeah,
one of the waves in the
right.
other direction.
Gotcha.
And so
So
but
your
I could
teachers are
tell,
lying to you. You're a nihilist.
yeah, I'm definitely falling down that pit. And
Yeah.
so I'm having a really difficult time with that and trying to gather the important things. Um, out of nowhere, my dad is kind of sitting on the floor of our living room with his laptop open, and he's playing. He says, "Oh, you should check out this guy. He has some really cool ideas." And it was Ravi Zacharias. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yep. Yep.
And so uh, that kind of I don't know was exactly what I needed in that moment to kind of push me out of a lot of the
Hmm.
nihilist stuff. And with that, I really got into Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton.
Hmm.
And so that quickly became my favorite book. And so I really dug into that. In senior year of high school, I was part of a class that was called Humanities, but really it was a philosophy class that
Mm-hmm.
had a history and a like literary section.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of a really intensive class. We had to read basically through all the canon, everything back from Plato. We read parts of the Torah, the Gospel. Like everybody was required to read two Gospels.
Hmm.
Um, we read parts of the Quran. We read Sartre. We read Simone de Beauvoir. We read Descartes. Just Dante's
Lovely.
Inferno. It was
Man,
just going through.
I love those kinds of classes.
It was amazing.
I hope they don't stop. Um, but yeah, those have been yeah, I'm glad to hear that's I feel like these days education's falling apart so much that like, you know, that sort of thing is hard to come by, but it is alive in some places, so I'm glad to hear that.
Definitely. Well, it's also sort of shift that class. They're not wanting to teach. Um, and I don't know the specific reason. My brother went into the class later, but they didn't want to teach the Gospels anymore because they felt like Dante was enough Christianity to kind of give people enough of an idea of what was going
Huh.
on. And there's certain things like that where I'm like, I
Yeah.
that's kind of tough.
I mean, don't get me
Um,
wrong, I love Dante, and we can talk about this later. Probably, I can make some very controversial statements in terms of weighing. If I were on a desert island, would I rather have the Gospels or Dante? And well, I won't say which here in this context. But so no knock against Dante, but come
no,
on,
yeah,
you gotta read the Gospels,
or at
if
least
you're going
one,
to.
like,
Yeah, that's true. You
um,
don't have to read all the synoptics as long as you get one of them in there. You can
yeah.
again, gosh, sorry. I don't want to, I'm probably going to anger people with my flippancy, but I also, you know, I'm being, I'm just being fun. I'm being silly. Obviously, we need all those, because
I mean, yeah.
they've got different things to contribute. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm derailing the
Oh,
conversation.
no. I do want to bring up Dante again, though. I think that
Oh,
there's something there
definitely. Yeah.
to talk about, especially with metamodernity. But so I take that class. There's some amazing conversations that we have because that's half the class is you read it outside
Yeah.
and then you come in and you have the conversation.
Yeah.
And when we're going through feminism and we're going through Simone de Beauvoir, I pose the question to my fellow classmates: would you rather have someone who identifies as a feminist but does not act like it, or someone who acts like the perfect feminist that you're looking for but doesn't identify as a feminist?
Mm.
And that's where somebody in the class very clearly stated they would rather have someone who supports the movement but doesn't act like it.
Hmm.
And I could see that shift happening, and I was like, that's scary to me. Like that's
Yeah.
really disturbing.
Yeah. Sure.
Um, and so that kind of gets put in my mind. I end up going to university for computer science and just kind of continuing to do a little bit of this kind of work in the places I can. And then
What sort of
uh,
stuff did you do with computer science? Do you like web programming, coding?
in high school as part of my robotics team, but for the most part, it was more just academic stuff. I got
Oh,
to do
sorry. I
little
thought you said
projects.
that you went to university and did it.
Oh, I did. I was just saying where it started. And
Oh, gotcha,
yeah,
gotcha. Yeah.
computer science, though, is for the most part in the university is not very applied. There's some of
Hmm.
it, but a lot of it's really theoretical.
Hmm.
And so that's something that I've had a little bit of trouble with, which is
Interesting.
I reached a certain point where I was pretty far in the program, but I'm like, I don't know how to do any of this. Like, what am I supposed to do with this? And
Interesting.
so that's a lot of self-learning that has to happen for the most
Hmm.
part. Yeah, and then I ended up running into Paul Vander Clay, and I was like, oh, like there's somebody who is doing a good job of taking things that are not necessarily in his sphere and being able to integrate them and talk about them in the context of um, just his beliefs and his views. And so,
Hmm.
uh, and there's plenty of conversation around there and just kind of sinking into it. So,
Gotcha. And if I'm not, is that a wedding band on your finger?
yes, I'm married.
So that happened. That's a big thing
Yes,
in the
that
story.
did.
Obviously, you have to pick and choose, so you're 24 though and married, which is, how long ago were you married?
I got married around 7 months ago.
Okay. Well, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is a big part, but
Yeah.
for yeah,
Cool, man. Thanks for that. That's helpful context. And you've already heard my 2 hour long chat with
no.
Paul Vander Clay, I'm sure. So I don't have to give you all that again. Cool. Well, yeah, that's helpful. I mean, so yeah, any of those questions you want to dive into, we get into it.
Yeah. Let me I think I might have had something up. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is one kind of thing I've been going through, and I thought it would apply. First of all, I wanted to ask you, what is your experience with video games for the most part?
It's an interesting question. Um, Very minimal, to be honest. When I broke my femur at 10 years old, I was in the hospital and my youth pastor came to stay. And they had, PlayStations and Nintendo 64s and everything that you could wheel in and, play to distract you from your suffering and that sort of a thing. And so when he stayed, they wheeled in PlayStation and I played some Siphon Filter on PlayStation. And and I just like thought this was really, really cool. And I kind of bonded with my youth pastor over it. And he drew this picture of me saying, Brendan Dempsey, I am Siphon Filter. And so this started to become a thing after I got out of the hospital because he was kind of into games. And so there was a brief period where I was like, hey, maybe I'm a gamer, maybe this is part of my identity. Uh, and then he left, and then I sort of lost interest in games. But like I love GTA 3. You know, when I was a kid, we had PlayStation 2, and you know, it was, but in short, you know, without just sort of waxing nostalgic in a way that no one will find interesting. Um, I it was really just a youthful thing, you know, Crash Bandicoot, and you know, I grew up with a Nintendo and stuff like that. But in terms of like what it's become, you know, for a lot of people is like gaming culture and playing online with people and all that. It's never been never been a thing in my life, really. No.
Got it. The reason I ask is because that's one of the things that I explore on my channel. But
Mm,
um, going back to kind of a while back, I had this idea that um, in some way that we need to be able to test ideas in a way that's
hmm
practical
hmm
because there's certain layers of truth to explore, and one of them
hmm
is like, you know, the um, I'm trying to remember the word for it, but the dialogical truth, the your propositional is what I'm trying to get at.
hmm hmm
So
hmm
there's a level of that where you make your arguments for whatever your viewpoint is, and you can go back and forth on that. But what hadn't been explored as much as I would have liked is the practical element. Like
hmm
living this out in life, does it
mm,
produce good results? Because if it
right.
doesn't, then what's the point?
Yeah.
And so I made a video a while back of myself playing an RPG, Fallout New Vegas,
hmm
and my intention was I'm going to play it as a nihilist would play this.
hmm
And so I go through and I give all the arguments for nihilism as I play, and
Nice. Okay. Yeah.
I go through that and I bring up the major philosophers in the movement, and I end it and I try to make this point that I think nihilism can make all the sense in the world, but in the end, it leads to you're not able to make any decisions
Right. Yeah.
because if every decision is useless, you have no decision making facility. And
Yeah.
what's the point?
Yeah.
And so that led me down this rabbit hole of and I was trying to think of a name for it, and it's hard to avoid the meta tag, but like meta pragmatism. Like it's not
hmm
about just pragmatism, but it's about the zooming out. It's
Yep.
the layer abstracted
Yeah.
level of like, does this work?
hmm
Um, and so I was just curious some of your thoughts on
Yeah.
that because
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, things can work at so many different levels, and that needs to be taken into account as well. Right. For example, you can scam someone and get away with it, and that
hmm
works. But if you live your life as a scammer, you know, is that going to quote unquote work for you? And those sorts of things, right? So it's like really trying to assess um yeah, the not just in sort of a limited scope or frame, but to really zoom out and think about the span of a whole lifetime, you know, what is in your interest. Because when I was dealing with nihilism, that was a big thing that I couldn't really resolve. It was sort of like, huh, okay, so, you know, for me, that was very much wrapped up with the atheism bit, and it was sort of like, well, there is no God, and morality is just this thing that we evolved to kind of like, you know, cohere a society. Um, you know, if you were aware of that, why not just become a free rider, you know, and kind of do whatever you want and take advantage as you need to. You know, I was wrestling with this mainly as a theoretical issue. It's funny too, because being enculturated into a Christian, you know, faith and lifestyle and all that, made my personality temperament probably such that I, you know, even if I could commit to that intellectually, it wasn't like I was about to go screw a bunch of people over. Because that was another interesting thing too. The other aspect of that, just as a tangent, is you know, also uh I think temperament plays a lot as well in biology. So you can't necessarily, it's not just about upbringing, but I do think it's important to factor that in. Anyway, coming back to the question though. Yeah, so it was sort of like, what do you do then when, you know, if you've sort of peeked behind the veil and you've gotten this dark truth that there is no basis for these things other than, let's say, social control, you know, what's to keep you honest and all this stuff. And I didn't have an answer for that at the time. I now feel very passionately um that the answer is that actually to this issue of like meta-pragmatism is that living the ethical life is the good for you, and for your community and for the kind of, all stakeholders. Um, and that there's actually, right, like if you just boil it down to, oh, what could I do and get away with it because, kind of Dostoevskian sense, if there is no God, then all things are possible. That's the kind of limited frame where you're assessing like, rewards and consequences and things, but that's not the right frame. You want to expand your scope and think about um your entire set of relationships and interactions and all of that. And when you expand that scope wide enough, I think you get the appropriate vantage, which is that ethical relationships are just the smart thing to do, that they are intrinsically worthwhile, I guess you could say, and that value is something that actually, yeah, is for the well-being of sort of all parties. So nihilism actually fails as a pragmatic philosophy for a lot of the reasons that you're describing.
I
And yeah,
I try to go one step further though.
sure.
Not just that, because I think there's a way you could take it, which is you can't live life as like a full, like honest psychopath. Like you're just
Mm.
not going to work. I try to go further and say, um, in nihilism, you're not just randomly killing people. Or no, you would have to be randomly killing people because there's no
Yeah,
decision maker.
right, right.
Um, just as but you're not killing everybody because if you're killing everybody, then like that itself is a decision
Yeah,
maker. That is a
right.
value system.
Yeah.
And so, but even to say if it was random, that also is a value decision. It's saying, well, the random
Hmm.
dice is more ethical than any other.
Right.
And so there is no sense to it. There's no
Yes.
like it's unlivable. Like
It
if
leads to a performative contradiction,
mhm.
as you'd say. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Keep going.
No, exactly. I think
Yeah.
you got it.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And actually it's very interesting because in my own sort of spiritual journey, that realization led me to an interesting path, which is if you're really going to accept nihilism, then you also have to recognize that, I'll put it this way, some people might land in a nihilistic stance because they've wanted to follow the dirty dark truth, and it's sort of like, all right, I'm, my teachers are lying to me, and so you want to be skeptical and cynical and doubt everyone and blah 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 blah. And then as you do that, you follow this dark truth to this place where you realize, oh, actually truths are just, dot 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 dot. And so a lot of, yeah, what leads people to a nihilistic stance is actually this sort of like commitment to at least intellectual honesty no matter what. But then that's interesting because once you're there, then you're like, well, wait a second, why should I uphold intellectual honesty? Even, and Nietzsche was, I think, one of the first people to really, I don't know, at least get me thinking in these terms, because he realized that even philosophy and its commitment to truth still had these metaphysical commitments that are sort of holdovers from theology in many ways. And so if you really follow that line all the way down and kind of deconstruct really, really far down, then you get to the point where your justification for nihilism itself is sort of undermined, let's
Mhm.
say. And then at that point, it's really interesting because for me, this wound up being very helpful and productive because I would say, all right, well, there's no truth. And basically, you know, we want to maximize feeling good because that's at least something that, is something that people can't make me doubt what feels good. Um, and if having a sense of meaning is makes me feel good and seems to increase my well-being, then nihilism actually became an argument for adopting a meaningful stance for reality because, a nihilist can't come around and be like, hey, hey man, you can't do the meaning thing because you have to, have some intellectual honesty and integrity. And it's like, it's like that scene in The Big Lebowski where it's like, but it's not fair. And he's like, fair? Who's the freaking nihilist here? I don't know if people are familiar with that movie, but highly recommend it. Point being, yes, I think that nihilism leads to its own undermining if fully pursued to its depths. And out of that becomes the seed of a new relationship to meaning, which begins from a purely kind of pragmatic, you could say maybe meta pragmatic stance that at least orients you towards meaning, uh, that I think is sort of intuitive and almost from a kind of hedonistic drive. for lack of ever for anything else. Even if you give up on value, you give up on truth, there's a kind of animal, desire, I guess you could say, that could kind of push you in the direction of reorienting towards meaning and value because they're in your own self-interest. And then I think as you get on that path, then the participatory aspects of pursuing a meaningful existence start to fill in the details and start to change your perspective in a way that, I don't know, that was my experience very much. It was sort of like a ladder down into a pit, and then at the bottom of the pit is sort of like you find the other ladder to, like, climb out on the other side. But then by the time you get back up out again, you look down, you're like, oh yeah, I used to be a nihilist, but it was because I was a nihilist that I committed to meaning again. Now I'm not a nihilist. I don't know if that makes sense, but that was kind of my own
No,
trajectory a little bit.
that's really good. And this is a weird question because I could easily find the answer, but I just haven't yet. Um, you were describing to Paul in your conversation your a little bit of your epic that you wrote,
Mm-hmm.
and you talk about the descent into hell and seeing God dead at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how did that character get out of hell?
Mm. Good question. Well, and persnickety point, I should be clear. It's the underworld, not
Underworld,
hell per
sorry.
se.
Yeah.
But which is, I think, I mean, for theologically minded viewers, it might be significant, but probably not otherwise. But anyway, good question. So, yeah, I mean, I would, oof, where do I start answering that question? Um, Simply put, the simple answer would be, okay, the poet finds God, and God is mad and blind, and not fully realizing that he's even fallen. So there's this sort of tragic situation where the poet finds God, thinking that he's still in heaven, and he's blind, and so he has these little ants that are down at his feet in the mud, and he's like, and here are my acolytes, and here are my worshipers and everything, and his little, like, rock that he's sitting on, he's like, and here's my throne, and all this stuff. So it's that kind of a scene. And what happens though is that the poet tries to convince God that actually he, the poet, is God, and that he created God. And so then there's this sort of realization moment, this sort of conversion experience that God has. Uh, and again, you'd have to read the poem to kind of see how all this plays out. Where he basically buys this story of the poet. He's like, ah, yes, you're right. Like, mankind created me, and so I'll follow you anywhere. You're my God. So there's this ironic reversal of roles now, where the human takes the role of the God, and God is taking the role of the, believing that he is, the follower of this other creator, kind of poet as creator. And so then he, relents to being taken out of the underworld, and following the poet. Problem is, the poet doesn't actually know where he's going and has made all this up, and essentially to in a effort to just try to move things forward. So eventually they find this, like, mountain, and the poet thinks, oh, we'll climb up to the sky from this mountaintop or something. And so God gets on his back, and they climb up the mountain, but there's nothing. There's nothing for them there. So then the poet kind of has to come clean to God. He's like, you know what? Actually, I'm not God. I can't, basically, I can't do what I said I would do, and is sort of embarrassed about it. And again, there's this kind of ironic moment now where, like, where in some ways the poet is in the position of having to confess to not being all powerful the way that maybe God had to confess that, to the poet. So they're sitting there together, and and then God starts kind of reflecting on all this, as sort of someone who now himself has lost faith, you could say, in God. Um, and and he starts kind of reflecting and saying, well, maybe there is some truth to this, essentially, because, it's through it's through feeling that there's truth as well. Like, not all truth is in equations and math, and you could say propositional
Mhm.
knowing, right? There's a participatory, there's a deeper kinds of knowing that we find in art, that we feel, and you can't dissect a symphony into its notes and think that you've understood it. There's this reductionistic fallacy to all that. And so he kind of through the soliloquy, God comes to the conclusion, that like truth is deeper than all of that. And a lot of this stuff I think would resonate very deeply with TLC folks, because I think a lot of their orientations back to faith are through a kind of gesture like this. And so anyway, so he says to the poet, well, so sing me a song, because the whole time the poet, has got this lyre that he's been carrying around. And so then the poet starts to sing to God. And he starts to, and Dante's involved here, but we can get into that later. But he starts to sing this song about all the ways in which truth is bigger than just fact. That all the ways in which there's a deeper something else going on. You could call it that metapragmatism we were just talking about. That is a part of the equation that needs to be taken into account, right? That like if you, just zoom in on everything essentially in the world, it's mostly empty space. But when you zoom out, everything is solid. And how does that work? So there's all this kind of exploration during this kind of song that the poet sings that has to do with like moving beyond reductionism, appreciating aesthetics and the lived participatory phenomenological sense of meaning, et cetera, et cetera. And as he's doing this, the poet realizes that all the tumbled blocks of heaven, which had rained down from heaven when it was overthrown and kind of landed in this heap, they all start to reconfigure into this staircase. Um, and part of this is when the poet goes down into the underworld, he realizes that his music is what he has a kind of orphic power to his music. It's able to make stones move and things grow and all this stuff. So the one thing living in the underworld is the poet, his music, and there's all this Dantean stuff going on there, and or orphic, mythology and stuff. Anyway, so but as he's singing this song to God, yes, this stairway starts to emerge out of the tumbled blocks of heaven, and they start to reconfigure up into the sky. And so the poet ends his song, and he's like, and God says, uh, that's beautiful, essentially, and worthy of heaven, or something to that effect. And then the poet says, well, let's go rebuild it. So then he puts God back on his shoulders, and then they go up on the stairway, and then they climb back to the overworld that way. So, you know, interpret that. I don't know how, I mean, I know how you'd interpret that, but
Mhm.
it's like, I can't just tell you how did they get back to heaven. It has something to do with digging deep into the ways that meanings are more than just propositional, knowing that they're participatory and phenomenological. It's about music and art and the role that creativity does actually play in, our transcendence.
Mhm.
Um, and it's about reconciliation and forgiveness, also. So it's about a lot of things. So that's how they get out of the underworld.
Definitely. Well, part of the reason I brought it up was when I first heard you mention it. Well, I've had this experience where I'll hear a story, or he'll hear bits of a story, or
Hmm.
see a trailer for a movie, and I'll have an idea of what the story would be, and I really
Mm.
like that idea.
Hmm.
Um, but then I'm disappointed when I actually see the story play out.
And that's exactly the experience people will have when they read my book. Is they'll think this is a great idea, but Brendan botched the whole delivery thing. No, I'm just kidding. Well, maybe not.
Well, well,
But sorry, go on.
when you described it, I didn't quite think that it would play out the same way, and so I
Mm,
actually wrote, if you don't mind, I can share it. But I
yeah.
wrote a poem, kind of
Oh yeah.
my interpretation, and I didn't know about the singing part, 'cause I
Hmm.
think the Orpheus kind of level of this I think is actually really important.
Hmm.
Um, this is my pitiful attempts. I've only started writing poetry recently, so
Awesome.
um, a wrinkled tanned hide over bones, tufts of white hair in all the expected places. A man sits on a stump of a throne, my gold at his feet, under shin-high water. Gutters rumble under the torrent. This chamber has been filling for a century. Unlike the stumbling shades, I know this man. He holds his abdomen, gripping a familiar wound. My melody has opened the door. The notes whispered to me my last hope, to my dead god. He sat unrestrained, tapping his knee, keeping track of the cold drops, drumming against his sun-stroked skin. His wrists were pale, scarred, centuries of rubbing, grinding, tearing against shackles. I suppose his ankles would show the same. Upon my approach, I am met by a stranger's familiar face. He spreads broken, chapped lips. Blood runs down his half-toothless smile. As if to hold in his stomach, he held his right arm against it. He straightened his spine as he asks, "Who is the great fool who enters my room?" His voice creaked and rippled out, subtly shaking stone. His words were immediately followed by unnerving laughter. In that moment, my hope fell, glass shards filling my stomach. In his life, I gave all that I had to my God. My money, my songs, my love. Oh my gosh, my devotion, my attention. When he died, I gave more than I had to get him back. I followed to the pits of hell, the damp, musty basement. Now his knowing smirk crept like ice up my back, right into my chest. I chose wrong, my world on his shoulders. Where once I saw care, I see the truth, a hatred of proper order that despised him, a lust to see all drawn down with him into the stinking pit. The satisfaction drained from his facade as he folds again in disgust. My knees fall and hit the standing pool, arms stretched to meet the stone floor. I sink deeper than I know, deeper, deeper. I let it go. All that I have is worthless now. I resign myself to the waves when I hear a new song that flips me upside down and calls me home. And
That's
so,
awesome. That's
thank you.
amazing.
Yeah. And so my vision is, I think Dante captures it. The Oh, there's a few bits here. I hate dissecting my own poetry because I'm killing it by talking about it. But
I know, I
um,
get it.
the in my framing, the god in the underworld is in a box. But the problem is, as soon as you put God into a box, is that God anymore?
Mm-hmm.
That's one bit of it. The other bit is, what do you do once you reach the bottom? And uh, Dante's image of it is, well, you just go to the other side. At the bottom is the foot of the mountain, and um, the path down is the deconstruction,
Mm-hmm.
and then what is the foot of purgatory? And that's kind of the question
Hmm.
that I've been kind of wrestling with. At least that's been my interpretation of some of this metamodern pieces.
I want to, I mean, so your poem is so cool. Part of what's so kind of blowing my mind about it though is just how like you haven't read my version, right? And so
No, I only heard what you said on Paul's
right.
podcast.
And so
Yeah,
there's such a fascinating overlap. So I'm tempted to just read a couple lines from mine and just so you can hear the relationship if that would be
yeah, yeah, I'm sure.
worth the time. Yeah, I think well, oh okay, I just found it in my bookcase. Hold on. I mean, even down to like some of the questions and whatnot that get asked. So this is right when the poet meets God and sees that he's blind and everything. So then so yeah, it goes from here. Who's there? The startled deity cries out, his hollow sockets pleading with the air for images, his voice cracked through with fright. But in my horror's paralyzing silence, his fear unfolds. A desperate smile contorts his eager wrinkles to a sadder hope. My son? My Jesus? Are you there, my dear? The question casts its longing like a net in tepid swamps where fish no longer live. But I, transfixed by shock, in petrified, in stunned despair, I can say nothing, cut by the soul's wound of seeing God undone, God eyeless, frantic. Stumbling to my words again, I strain to make my solemn homage stand, when all within my heart is downed and dark, and teetering on grief that threatens ending. Lord, I, I, such sounds, stammering, dumb, wade wastes of speaking through a viscous dread, soul fighting forfeits current. But to sink upon this mountain summit hurts mind more, and I, heart digging heels into the rock of riverbed conviction, fight the foam and blows, and long sighing, try words again. Not he, my lord, yet something still your child. And while my name as yet makes no great noise, still once above I played your humble bard, and sang such songs as soothed divinity and praised your lordship. Punctured by my words, I watched the troubled exile sink his head and hopeful brow, the first toward the earth, the second to a heart-sick grimace. Now the one is raised again, the other stuck in sadness. Yes, he mumbles through his beard, in brighter tones that shade his disappointment. Of course, a singer of sweet songs. And then, with all the speed that children lose their sorrow, he smiles again, an elder's smile, whose sort an old man wears to clothe forgetting. Suns now strange, yet hides all question and decorum, which paints minds' wrestlings to maintain in age dear masks of dignity. And yet, his grief so swiftly doused, dark passions flare anew. Mad, trembling dreams returned. He cries, "But if to this blind prison you have freshly come from heaven, tell me all. Where is my son? Does the sweet light no longer strike his eyes?" The god's whole look contorts in clenched suspense as spittle slurs with exclamation out. But I, remembering now that fateful battle, when down the cloudy vales to Eden man attacked, and our guns tore the Savior's wound, when knowledge crucified a broken Lord, remembering this, Christ's image in my eyes, now I'm the one to sink his head and blush, embarrassed at my blasphemy. Anyway, obviously it's an epic poem, so I could keep going on and on. But
Hmm.
there weren't some. I couldn't get to some of the images there, but there's so many things in your poem that like it's just fascinating to hear that. And actually, I'm very honored that you would take that vignette or that image or that idea as something that to explore in your own version of that because yeah, that's really cool. So anyway, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that. That was really awesome.
Well,
As for
thank
your
you.
question about deconstruction, Dante, the bottom of hell. Can you reframe it again? Rephrase it?
Yeah. Well, and one thing I do want to catch too is the the image I used at least was inspired by Prometheus.
Mm.
That
Hmm.
Prometheus is the image of the god that's dead.
Man, that's so funny. I mean, yeah, gosh. I'd love it. I'll send you a copy of my poem if because all these things show up there in a very intentional way. So I mean, but they're archetypes, right? I mean, that's why
Hmm.
these things are so profound, I think. I mean, I draw a lot from Prometheus Unbound, if you've ever read that. Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus. In fact, anyway, I'm sorry. There's a lot of things
Oh, no
that this
worries.
brings up for me. But so go on. So you're drawing on that image, and yeah,
Yeah, and I think that that fit the image in my
yeah,
mind at least.
yeah.
And I'll make this point and we can kind of talk about the Dante part, but
Hmm.
um the the Prometheus in the pits of hell or the underworld, um that's the god that gave humanity the fire.
Hmm.
Um but depending on which version you choose, right? But he doesn't really care about humanity to a certain
Mm.
extent.
Mm.
Like he cares about kind of messing with the order of things.
Mm.
And so humanity can look at that and be like, "Oh, like thank you for doing this. Like
Hmm.
you're the one who brought us here." And he's like, "I don't care about you. Like what are you doing
Uh-huh.
here?"
Uh-huh.
Um and that sudden realization that like the God that you had pictured it, you could put this in like the prosperity gospel kind of frame or whatever frame you want to put it. Um the box that you put the divine into, you realize that you weren't able to capture it. Like you
Mm.
put your hands over it and you thought you had it, and then you open it and it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
Um but also kind of going into the Dante thing, the framing I had for it was that I think if you capture metamodernity as, you have the modern, where there's the everything is kind of working as it should, and but we see something's wrong, like something is not being accounted for, and then you have to go, deal with each layer of what's wrong, the
Hmm.
lust in the world, the greed, the violence, all of that stuff, and you break it all down and you feel like you hit the bottom. um, then Dante twists it and says, well, actually, once you hit the bottom, you find that you're on the foot of Mount Purgatory,
Mm,
that there's a lot more work to do. And that's
mm,
the reconstruction
mm,
or
mm-hmm,
reintegration or
mm,
I know you're planning on talking to Neil and Chad sometime, I think. And he does it as reenchantment is the way he
mm-hmm,
likes putting it.
mm-hmm,
And so there has to be this layer. And that's been what I've been kind of processing through. Like what does that look like? I think C.S. Lewis does an interesting job with The Great Divorce because I've been going through that
mm-hmm,
several times.
mm-hmm.
Um, the walking on the grass that can't be moved and
Yeah, yeah.
the trying to pick up the apples that you could never bring back with you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess I tend to come through it more of like an archetypal Jungian reading of it, less kind of strictly theological. Because I mean, obviously they're related. But I guess I feel like Lewis is a bit more theological in his exploration in The Great Divorce of, what these things mean and how they would play out. Whereas Dante's whole thing is like, I mean, not to say that Dante isn't theological, but the here's a theory that I have actually. To go really sideways for a second here. So it's fascinating if you compare the cosmology of Dante
Mhm.
to other world religions. There's absurd parallels. And obviously, Dante's not inventing this. He's just kind of the crowning achievement of like presenting this as a really coherent architecture. But he's drawing on the entire Western tradition up for 1300 years, and then obviously all the classical tradition too. So anyway, so it's not Dante's invention at all. It's just his sort of like presentation and codification of it. But when you consider this mountain structure, right, when he gets to purgatory, surrounded by a sea, whoops, on top of which is a garden.
Mhm.
And then from there open up the celestial hierarchies of different heavens. um you actually find that exact same structure in Buddhist metaphysics, Buddhist cosmology, where it's Mount Meru, surrounded by these waters. You get to the top of it, and there's this garden, and then that opens up into these sort of cascading heavens, and so, you could look at that and say, oh, well, this proves something that this was true or something like that. But my theory is that the reason why you see these profound cross-cultural similarities is because this isn't an architecture of reality or metaphysics. It's actually the architecture of the human psyche, in like obviously, in like a metaphorical symbolic way, meaning you're not going to find this structure if you open up someone's brain, right? But like there's
Mhm.
something about all this that you can actually relate very directly to those waters that surround the mountain are the waters of the unconscious. And in fact also in both of these things, and when you go down you're getting into the hell realms in both of these cosmologies. So Eastern and Western share this profound architectural similarity in this sort of cosmic map. And so, that is like the domain of beasts and dragons and in the underworld, right? And all this is in the Jungian architecture, and it's submerged and all that. And then you get to the mountain, and there's this ascent that you have to do, which I think is life, in many ways. Like I studied Dante for a year at Yale Divinity School with this year-long course that Peter Hawkins taught, and his favorite uh, um, canticle was Purgatory, because it's the most like life. When
Mhm.
people are in hell, they're suffering and it's very intense, and there's a little bit of torture porn dynamics going on there. And when you're in Paradiso, everything is so celestial and sublime, it's a little hard to relate to. But Purgatory is so relatable, and you meet everyone on the way, and you're like fellow pilgrims, and you're all on your pilgrimage up to the top of the top of the mountain, as it were, which is a profound sort of metaphor for life. And actually in like the Buddhist cosmos, this is where kind of humans in a sense kind of reside, if that makes sense. Like this is kind of where more of kind of standard beings hang out. Um, but then as you get to the top, you get to this garden, and you get to this sort of culmination of, the full richness of the lived experience, and the richness of the good and the true and the beautiful, and the valued telos of life and all this stuff. And then from there, you explore yeah, like the transcendent realms that are even beyond our ken. Anyway, I'm rambling. I don't want to make this all about some kind of thing about the architecture of, cross-cultural architectures east and west of the psyche as experienced in Dante and Buddhist cosmology. But I just find that fascinating. So, and it does pertain to this whole question about, I think, what you're getting at. So, what do you get to when you go to the bottom of hell, right? And as for that question of like, is that deconstruction? Um, hmm. I'd have to think about that. I don't think it's really, I think that would be reading into what you're seeing in something like Dante,
Hmm.
um, where, one, the other thing that this all breaks down in a very powerful way, and this is why I think it's a psychological topology, is because this is a hierarchy of value, right? This is the
Hmm.
great chain of being. This is the bad, awful things and sort of subhuman realms are submerged in the murky waters. And as you go through, things become more familiar until you get to the higher realm of things, and then you get into the celestial heavens, and then you find the angels or the devas, these like very valuable, beautiful, shining beings and this sort of a thing. And it's not that these places exist, though they are phenomenological states of being, you could say, and that if you're trying to chart a path through the hierarchy of value, you know and Petersonian fans will get this, right, because God is the in the Dantean cosmos and the great chain of being, he is the top of the hierarchy of value, where everything is tending, you could say. And so it is this kind of grand scale of value. But again, it's crucially, this is a psychological interpretation of reality. It's not like we can go out into the real nature of the cosmos and find this, right? This is part of the big disenchantment experience of modernity. People thought if you had a telescope and you looked out, you'd see this stuff, and it's like they didn't realize actually you needed to turn inward to see this stuff, because this is psychic topology and cosmology. It's not like natural cosmology. So anyway, I've lost my train of thought, but I love this stuff, so
Yeah.
I just get excited.
No, no, I think I have a hard time avoiding the beginning of Inferno. Um the Lost in the Woods Dante. And
Mm-hmm.
he is having his dark night of the soul, and
Yes, yes, yeah,
he's experiencing this. And I
right,
think that's where I think the connection to the
yes,
metamodern is
yeah,
um he is kind of in this. I don't know. I connect with that, and maybe I'm reading into it my own kind of
no, I think that's
thoughts,
right.
but then his going down is his recognition of like um this is hell is made up of value structures of
Mm,
people who are saying no, this is the most important thing,
yeah,
and it goes from the easiest stuff to deal with almost
yeah,
to the
right,
most difficult, like the
yeah,
most core
yeah,
uh amount. And it's not letting go of each of these things entirely, but it is the re-proper ordering
yep,
that hits the bottom, and then you have
yeah,
to do now that things are properly ordered,
yeah,
now there's work to do.
yeah. I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, I mean, so Augustine said, that basically, like, God is our highest sort of, yeah, value. And so we rightly feel this love and desire for that, but we have perverted loves, essentially,
Hmm.
misplaced loves. And if our hierarchy of value is off, then we will be askew and we will suffer for that. And yeah, I think obviously C.S. Lewis really uh, emphasizes this point even beyond what Dante does, that this is sort of, I mean, as Paul Vander Clay is fond of noting, that hell's locked from the inside, that there's this thing that like people are holding on to something that's keeping them in hell, right? There's this incredible scene where he's getting down really to the bottom, and there are these two people locked for eternity, eating each other, basically. Or what is
Hmm.
it? One is eating the other's head, or something like this. And it's sort of like that, yeah, this isn't sort of like God's punishment per se, though there is some of that theology thrown in. It's more like these people have become consumed in such a way by their vices, because their desire, their love is for something that is self-destructive. You know,
Hmm.
it's kind of like, to make a, what does Milton say? To compare great things with small. It's kind of like that. episode of The Simpsons where Homer gets his hand stuck in a vending machine. He wants, I don't know, it's like a soda or something or a candy bar, and he, and anyway, so he reaches out and tries to get it, and then he gets his hand stuck, and then the people come, and they've got to like take this vending machine apart and blah blah blah, and then they're like eventually, wait a second, Homer, are you just holding on to the candy bar? And he's like, yes. Um,
Hmm.
Meaning if he just let it go, he could have taken his hand out the whole time. And that's the profound psychological insight about like hellish states is that, uh is that, well, so conceived in that theological perspective, right? Misplaced love is our sort of undoing. And it's also great to see Dante as he's going down into hell, to see the various vices that he's prone to causing him to swoon or faint in a more intense way than for other things, which is
Hmm.
why, when he sees Paolo and Francesca and the whole um yeah, the things that evoke his own things he's got to work through, that's the stuff that really causes him some psychic turmoil. So, but I think you're right. I mean, it's the dark night of the soul, and it's the being lost in a dark wood, and it is then the need to descend in order to ascend, right? And I like what you said about there's almost like in the descent you realize what the proper order is, and you can kind of use that almost as kind of like the architecture that will allow you to properly readjust your sense of value. So yeah, to compare that all with sort of the Dark Knight and the nihilistic struggle, it's sort of like you've got to deconstruct everything and then get to the bottom. And then to compare this back with at least certainly my own version of this, when you are at the bottom and you've deconstructed it, it's precisely that pivot point that allows you to then reascend by means of the deconstruction. So anyway, yeah, based on
Well,
everything I've been putting out lately, I'm very I like that reading. That's good.
sweet. Yeah. I think there's one bit. I think Lewis captures it probably the best, where it's not only that the letting go, because I think you can easily get into this mindset of it's all letting go. It's saying
Mm,
like this is not important, even forgetting yourself. But it's again like the reordering. And so he has the image of the mother who desperately wants her child Michael and is like saying like where is my son? And all the people in heaven are saying, well, he's here. He's just not like he's not here right now. He's up the
mm,
mountain. He didn't
mm,
come down. And she's like, well, I won him. I'm not I came here for him.
mm.
And they're like, well, don't you understand
Right.
that if you just go up, you'll see him. Like you
Yeah.
won't see him immediately, but like you'll be able to live with him up there. And
Yeah.
then George MacDonald later in the poem says he implies, and she doesn't actually say this, but says she's probably right now desperately asking for Michael to come with her back into hell.
Hmm.
And this idea of it's the balance, right? Of like not and I don't know. I come back to the chapter of orthodoxy where it's the paradoxes of Christianity. It's not letting everything go, but it is letting everything go. And it's
Mm.
not holding on to everything, but it is holding on to everything.
Yeah.
And it's once it's all kind of organized, then that's the
Well, that's the other thing,
reintegration I think that I've been processing.
right? Like in order to save your life, you must lose it. I think
Hmm.
that's also true of the spiritual life in terms of like, in order to get meaning, you have to let go. You have to allow yourself to deconstruct. Um, and then you will gain that which you're desperately trying to hold on to. And so, again, trying to interpret these sorts of things in light of that aspect of the spiritual journey, I think is really interesting. And huh. Well, one quick nod to the fact that, like, using the dark night of the soul in this way is a particular way of talking about it. If you read, like, St. John of the Cross, this is not necessarily what he means. And there's a whole other way in which the
Mm.
mystical journey is, um, it's actually in that context. Well, we don't have to get into all that, but I mean, this resonates a lot more with me. One thing that I would want to do, though, is bring this all back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of value, in terms of the meta pragmatism, because the moves I want to make are to take all these insights, but then, how do we say, let's say, marry all of this with a kind of Vervaekian transjective framing, and a kind of Petersonian value hierarchy framing. Uh, where what I mean by that is that I want to kind of move us, again, you can't avoid the meta, right, sometimes, but into like a meta theological perspective on this, where the theological perspective is sort of like, okay, here's the architecture of the cosmos in a kind of spiritual sense. And, even without reading that quote unquote literally, there's still this sense of we're talking in terms of, heaven and hell and sin and grace and all these kinds of heavily theologically laden concepts. But if you want to expand that framing a little bit more and think in terms of value as it emerges transjectively, uh, then what we were talking about earlier, I think, is a really interesting perspective where, all right, this is good. This is good. So, we're talking about how from the right scope, you can see that actually the ethical life is in your own best interest, you could almost say, right? Let's put it this way. Living ethically it enhances the viability and the flourishing and the well-being of of the sort of maximal number of people and the kind of system as a whole, right? Whereas trying to be a scammer is thinking narrowly that, oh, I can sort of cheat the system and get and can sort of steal value in that way. But because it's so narrowly conceived and misguided, it winds up that the scammer ultimately suffers, right? That the cheater, the liar, the fraud, the whatever list of vices you want to now get into, the that leads to suffering. um and you could relate that all back to the sort of Dantean or Lewisonian insight around misplaced love and misplaced value, you could say. Because it's not that, right, like it's not that these things are bad. It's not that money, let's say, is bad, or wealth, or these sorts of things. But if you chase money, if that becomes your sole, prerogative, it's not that sex or the body are bad. But if you become so consumed by lust and addiction to, these sorts of things, then you suffer, et cetera, et cetera. It's like it's the narrowing in a kind of solipsistic, self-obsessed way that like latches and grasps onto the thing in a narrow sense that doesn't allow you to see the whole broader big picture perspective that leads to the suffering of the individual. Whereas if you expand the whole scope and you've got the whole ordered hierarchy in mind, you can see how everything kind of has its right place. And then you can say, yeah, actually, these things are, you can have an ordering of the passions, and then you get this sort of holistic systems perspective on value itself. And so that would be the sort of move that I'm interested in making, which I think can then get us out of the more tradition specific languaging of theological language and into the more universal framing of just how humanity does these things. Because again, to bring that up, that cross cultural parallel, right? Like it doesn't matter if you're in the West or the East, a Christian or a Buddhist, right? We've got this psychic sort of architecture and this topology, this cosmology that we're working with, that we are uh, we are working with hierarchies of value, and that these are universal phenomena, and that whether we call them devas or angels, whether we call it Mount Purgatory or Mount Meru, these are universal human things that we're dealing with. And so and because we are all people embedded in social and other kinds of contexts that need to impact the way we adjudicate value and meaning, we're all dealing with these sorts of things. And I think that the maximally open, non-tradition specific languaging of this could be a way that you could get sort of a meta theological perspective on all that. If any of that makes sense, I don't know if any of that makes sense, but
I think there's a piece of it. Oh, I had something. I'm starting to lose it. I think one thing that oh gosh, there's so much there where I'm
yeah, I do these
well,
rambles sometimes to try to pull all the threads together,
hmm.
but maybe it's too much. Also, we can just go back to Dante. I'll talk about
Oh,
Dante till forever.
let me think. I think I had it for a second and then I lost it. I think there's one kind of point about this value hierarchy is that I think sometimes we sometimes even get caught on the was it? I think it's Chesterton who talks about how what's more dangerous than the vices unleashed or the virtues unleashed.
Hmm.
This idea that you like even if you stick entirely to one of these good things, like if
Mm-hmm.
you go totally
Mm-hmm.
down this route,
Yeah.
you're gonna lose all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think meaning kind of fits this too.
Mm-hmm.
To pursue meaning in its entirety as an end in itself is also problematic. And so I think
Hmm.
I think sometimes we think that and I think that has to do with an authenticity thing, where it's now under the frame of the authenticity is good, in itself, and it is the
Mm,
good. And I think that's where I think Paul's work around authenticity, sincerity is really helpful.
mm,
Is to say that it's not even about being true to yourself or feeling like you're true to yourself, but it's actually being the fullness of yourself.
mm,
Um, Somebody who has been really helpful has also been like Mr. Rogers in framing this
mm-hmm.
of saying like, um, I don't know if this is an actual quote. This is like a quote that if he didn't say it, it's just been like put into me. Like it's just him
More
in my
true than
conscious.
true.
It's his
Yeah.
consciousness congress in going on. Um, but he says something along the line, like in my mind at least, something along the lines of somebody asks the question, you know, uh, what do you do about like not everybody is the best at something, right? Like
Mm,
there's the limited things in the world, and the response is, well, you are the best at something. You're the best at being you. Like there's no
mm,
one else in the world like you. You are the only one like you. And so that is the foot of purgatory, right?
mm.
It's the understanding that like each journey is going to
Yeah.
be unique in the process of finding your full potential.
Yeah.
And so and yeah, that's been again some other stuff that's been like floating around my mind. And so I've been kind
So
of messing around with the saints specifically. I think are really interesting case studies into
yeah.
that.
Yeah. Well, so one thought just again on that, like, whether he said this or not, it doesn't matter because that is,
Hmm.
I think that's, if we can work with a theology like that, I think we can do the metamodern theology thing that I'm trying to
Pseudo
advocate for
Rogers,
people.
you know.
Yeah, well, right, exactly. But then it's like, actually, again, we're really, ooh, there's so many threads here, but like pseudo Dionysius, so tragic because when people found out that it wasn't actually Dionysius who wrote, he wasn't Dionysius the Areopagite who wrote the Celestial Hierarchy in those texts, then he fell out of favor because they're like, oh, I guess it's not real, and I guess it's just some 6th century, Eastern Orthodox monk. And it's like, it doesn't matter. It's more real than it's more true than true, it doesn't matter. And so we just have this, when we stick pseudo in front of something, it's like, it's the same thing with the gospels, right? It's like, it doesn't matter that it wasn't Matthew who wrote the gospel or the John who wrote John. It's like, it's more, anyway, I won't go on that tangent again because I know everyone disagrees with me. But anyway, but what I wanted to say is also, there was a point I wanted to get into briefly about Peterson. I think is a little off with his whole notion about God as the top of the hierarchy of value, which I don't want to unpack. But I don't want to get into that right now. But you're talking about what you just said in the Saints and Dante. I wanted to emphasize it. So when Dante gets up into the celestial hierarchy of Pseudo Dionysius, and he sees the Empyrean, right, this sort of mandala of gyric angelic seraphim, all circling around the Godhead. um it's a kind of stadium or amphitheater of like everyone who's ever been entered, anyone who's ever kind of entered the kingdom of heaven, like, and all the saints are there, and it's this kind of, yeah, like stadial seating around, everyone's sort of oriented towards the divine. And what I love about this whole image is that you have this image of God, the Empyrean, that is itself a mandala of the integration of all the differences of every individual sorts of people, right?
Hmm.
They're all there and they're all in their individuality. Beatrice is there in the celestial hierarchy. And just as much as Dante's put people that he knew in hell, he also puts people that he knew in heaven in the Imperium. And the reason why I love that image so much, though, is it gets at this thing is that there is this unity and diversity, that all that individuation that we do as people in our Mr. Rogers sort of way of being our no one being better than us at being us, right? We maintain this uniqueness that is somehow enfolded into the celestial rose that constitutes the totality of the divine in all of its differences and pluralities, and yet it's somehow this integrated whole. And I think that that is a really perfect image for at least how I tend to think about orienting towards the divine, is the integration of differentiation into something with emergent properties that is the kind of maximally complex thing, to tie a bow around all that.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Well,
Mr. Rogers,
yeah.
Dante. Anyway, go on. Yeah.
I want to dig into that a little bit because I think well, Revelation has that bit, right?
Hmm.
You have all these people singing and they're of all tribes and all nations and they're singing in all their languages. there's not a unified language anymore.
Mm,
It's still different.
mm,
And so you have well one of the I'm kind of going to jump back and forth, but one of the conceptualizations I had of modernity is the Tower of Babel,
mm,
of building this tower up to the heavens because we can reach it with our technology.
mm,
And then the utter shattering of it all. And that's the postmodern. And it's just everybody is
mm,
scattered around the
mhm,
earth and they can't comprehend one another.
mhm,
And the um, I mean, you have Acts with the speaking in tongues, where there's now this almost unified ability that even though you're not necessarily speaking, one language is being spoken and it's being heard in
mhm.
different languages.
Yeah.
And then you have the kind of full integration in the vision of heaven of
Mhm,
this place where everybody's speaking differently.
mhm,
Um, and then going to, I think, St. Francis of Assisi, I've been reading a lot about, and
mm,
how he is on the far end of I'm going to be as poor as like humanly possible. I'm going to own like three things, and one of them is his own hair. And then I'm going to,
Not everybody has that. Let me tell you, it's a
yeah,
blessing if you can own your own hair.
well,
So,
enough to make a shirt out of it. I don't know if it was his own,
all
but
right. Yeah.
and so he takes it like he goes far down this direction, and all his followers agree to not have the property, and they have to beg for all their food. And in Chesterton's account of St. Francis of Assisi, the way he ends it is he talks about how, well, after St. Francis dies, um, all of his followers try to push to make the church like the Franciscan order,
Mm,
that we shouldn't have private property anymore. We should now like not have anything even communally owned.
mm,
And the church says no. And they say basically you can be a part of us, but we're not going to be you.
mm,
Like your spirit is now trying to like
mm.
subsume all of us.
Yeah.
But we will like still support you and keep you as part of us in our diversity.
Mhm.
Um, we have a role, and that's kind of like this idea of the orders. Um, and very
Yeah.
much so like that's my vision at least of Christianity as being this you have the Coptics and you have the Ethiopian. Each of them are preserving their own culture in a way.
Hmm.
Um, but it's not entirely. It's now there's a level of unity, and so you have
Yeah.
these both sides of it.
Yeah.
Um, and that's where I see like I don't know. Uh, I don't know how to phrase this, but it's almost like this metamodern idea of integrating
Hmm.
itself is Christian in a
Hmm.
sense.
Yeah.
And that's been something I've been kind of playing around with.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I've been trying to kind of, you know, communicate or at least articulate in a way that maybe people will find compelling, whether or not they buy it or not. That's, I think, a very valid move to try to, bridge these two things together of metamodernism, Christianity. And then let me see if I can remember all these things because there are a couple of metamodern theological moves
Mm,
I'd want to make. And then I wonder how they land with you, but I also just kind of wonder how they ripple out with people watching this and like how they
yeah.
feel, right? Okay. So what you said about the church and the Franciscans, like, that's a very lovely interpretation. Let's say
Mm,
that's a true interpretation of that. And like we can fully grok that. And then I want to toggle to this other kind of postmodern, maybe more cynical view and be like, yeah, of course the church was like, actually, we're going to keep our shit, guys. So,
mhm,
we got a lot of really fancy, nice things. And, yeah, you can do your sort of, wandering mendicant vow of poverty, but we're also going to hold on to all this gold and jewels, right? And both of those things can be true, right?
mhm,
That we can appreciate maybe that there is an element of that going on in what happened historically, but none of that needs to ruin that beautiful reading that you know that you offered of that, or that Chesterton, whoever, offers of that reality. Like that's also true. And so that's again kind of this thing about the modalities of the true and the different kinds of ways that we can use different aspects of reality to toggle between different insights, and that it's only a danger when we absolutize one frame over the other. If we hear this other kind of more cynical, worldly, human, all too human interpretation, and then we say, no, 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 that's not true at all, and it can't be true, and then we try very hard to defend our one interpretation against that interpretation, and we can just kind of be like, yeah, both of those things are true. So I wanted to throw that out. Then the whole idea of, yeah, the integration, which all this is kind of gesturing towards, right, is is that perspective. I think that we can try our best to try to integrate these perspectives and try to hold them simultaneously or in a superposition, however you want to think about that, or oscillating back and forth between them, whatever. But like we don't really, you know, it's not like having to pick and choose either or. It's a both and that the kind of Christian theological vision is one that can allow for that. Similarly, right, you talked about, well, this was the other point, yeah, that so you make some wonderful usage of the Christian mythos. And I don't mean that term pejoratively. I mean that,
Hmm.
the richness of symbol and the tradition and everything, and the Tower of Babel and all that it can connote, and relating that to modernity and then postmodernity with the fragmentation and the micro narratives, you could say all that. Like, yeah, that's wonderful. All that is true. And then we can also say, yeah, but there wasn't actually a tower. That's it's a mythos, right? It's something that allows us to make sense. It's part of that psychic topology and cosmology. It's not like there's a place that we can go to and see, oh, here's where, the Tower of Babel or Babel was. And again, that we can hold those two things simultaneously without any one of them being detrimental in a sense to the other. And again, I don't know how that will land with people. I probably folks in TLC are more comfortable with the Tower of Babel being mythos than other things in the Bible. But I'm just saying that we can be Christians drawing on the rich tapestry and tradition of the religion, and and the ways in which that has to then penetrate with history or ancient history is sort of like, I just keep trying to make the point like that can be a totally separate thing. um those are the main things I wanted to say about that, which maybe don't seem particularly illuminating, but I think that I'm really trying to gesture to like the sensibility involved in this, which is trying to maintain all that plurality, right? Is we don't want to
Hmm.
collapse something into a singular unity. We want there to be a multiplicity for all the reasons that we're talking about. But then when you bring those multiplicities together, you get a surplus cohesion. You get something that emerges out of that. All the sum is greater. No, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, sort of a thing, right?
Hmm.
And so I think a successful religious tradition will have that dynamic to it. And that's why symbols are so potent. Like the Tower of Babel is modernity. It's also, Babylon. It's also, the hubris of humanity. It's all these things. It doesn't have to be locked into one sort of thing. And that the last thing I'll say is that one of those perspectives that I think the metamodern is really trying to emphasize is the negation of all the things that we're talking about. It is the deconstruction, right? That Dante doesn't write his Divine Comedy unless he has the Dark Night of the Soul. And so one of the things, it's almost like how you need a background to have a foreground, or you need, you need a figure ground distinction to set things apart from each other. You need the negation to have the positive. And so we need to have, as part of the plurality of perspectives incorporated and integrated, those that would also undermine and challenge and critique and problematize the other perspectives, and that has a place too. Yeah, I'll leave it there, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I'm interested to hear what your thought on this is, because I mentioned earlier about meaning as a highest good might be
Yeah,
problematic.
yeah.
Would integration also be problematic, potential
Hmm.
highest good? That all these things are tools in a certain sense.
Hmm.
There's the postmodern tool, and then there's the modern tool, and then
Yeah,
there's maybe the metamodern tool.
yeah,
And maybe it's our destiny to just overuse whatever we have in our hands, and then we always have to fix it. But
yeah.
part of me is
Yeah,
also
I think
saying,
so.
like, maybe maybe there's a point to the brakes are important, but maybe we need to press the brakes slowly and kind of fix things right and
Hmm.
and get to the right place.
Yeah, so these are really good questions. I mean, I'm inclined to say, okay, so one of the things that making the meta move does is it allows you to see that, um, let's say there's a broader, how am I going to communicate this? There's a broader pattern to things, um, than the specific instance that one thought was at play. Let me see if I can come up with an example that will kind of make this um, make sense. Okay, so let's say you grow up and you're like, oh, okay, um, to be healthy is to eat only vegetables, and to take, a bath every day, and to wash your hands, blah blah blah. You can have a whole
Hmm.
set of rules, right? And that'll like serve you pretty well. But then certain things will happen where actually, like, maybe sometimes some of those things don't serve you. Maybe actually you wash your hands too much, right? Maybe like your whole thing of, oh, I need to be healthy, and that means washing my hands actually makes you decrease the diversity in your microbiome and all this stuff that you, or you get, you take antibiotics as you think, oh, okay, this will help with the bacteria, but actually you need a flourishing gut, biome and all that stuff, right? Point is, you can use your set of rules to actually undermine the very thing that you think you're trying to get to. So there needs to be a failure in your set of rules, your kind of algorithm for things, to show you the cracks that are pointing to something else.
Hmm.
And then when you make that leap of awareness, you're like, hey, actually health isn't doing X, Y, and Z. Health is a process, right? Health is more like and then it becomes a more complex idea. It's homeostasis, that, you need to have the right balance of things, and you need to, it's not about eating only vegetables. It's about eating certain kinds of foods, right? So you've expanded and made more universal these categories that you're working with, right? And this is the process itself that kind of continues, right?
Hmm.
And so this is, I think, the meta move that then orients you to deeper structural and structuring patterns in reality. And the reason why that's really important then is because you can imagine each one of these moves as a kind of rather minor deconstruction, right? But I don't know, maybe for someone like following the rules, and in fact, obviously, you go back in religious traditions, this is a big thing, you've got to follow the religious rules around hand washing and purity and all this stuff, right? But what if those things were actually just gesturing towards something a bit more abstract, a bit more universal, of like, it's not about washing your hands 5 times a day at certain times. It's more like, yeah, washing your hands frequently is a good idea, right? That sort of a thing. And then so what happens is your things become more abstract in general and universal, but also more relative, more context sensitive, and more sort of you're sensitive to the contingency and other variables that are influencing these things. And it's not just like this. And so that is sort of the basic process, but this is a process that itself unfolds. So the reason why I say all that is because when you say, could making meaning the thing that is your maximal hierarchy of value be a problem, is because I think that meaning, at least as I conceive of it, is sufficiently, let's say, abstractified and sort of, if you have a good theory of meaning, and then we'd have to dive into all that.
Hmm.
I think then if you're working with a meta enough pattern, then you're less likely for that to become the absolutized totality, right? Because if you've already got to this pretty meta level thing, then you've already appreciated the fact that it's actually making absolutes of things that is what you want to try to avoid. And you want more relativity baked in, you want more contingency, and you want more of the pattern. And so if we're orienting towards that, then we're more likely to be orienting towards something that will be better for us, if that makes sense. And that's, to be honest, I wanted to plug that back into my critique of I think what I hear Jordan Peterson talking about in terms of just like there's this value hierarchy and like God is at the top. And I
Hmm.
don't think that's quite right. Obviously, it then depends on how you define God and all that.
Hmm.
But I think, I mean, as Peterson does talk about God, he is talking about basically a value hierarchy and that something is at the top of it. But the reason why I think that's wrong is there is not an absolute value hierarchy. Okay. Like there is a field of value and there are values that we have, but these things don't have absolute status in the sense that, like, I value water, but if I'm drowning, I don't value water, at least, right? And you can imagine all the iterations or permutations of these sorts of things that we have to go meta on what we mean by value and meaning to actually appreciate that what we mean by these things, and here's Vervaeke's great, is something transjective, that it is me in relationship to an environment in a kind of relational dynamic that is what makes things meaningful. What are the affordances I need in a given context to do a certain thing, right? Like, is this a hat or is it a glass? What? Now I've got water in my head. All this stuff, right? It's not all relative in a way that radically relativizes things and makes them meaningless. It's that meaning is itself inherently relative in a way that is absolute. The relativity of meaning is an absolute thing. Now that could become a dangerous, misplaced absolute, but we'll leave that aside. Point is, the reason why there isn't then a kind of absolute hierarchy of value at which God is at the top is because it misses that kind of contextual affordance thing. And that you have to think about meaning and value as being processual in nature and contextual in nature. And so the only way you could say that Peterson's God hierarchy value thing would make sense is that if you understand God in that frame to be something inherently contextual and transjective, then you can say, yes, there is a value hierarchy that leads to God, but God is, in a sense, already just like every aspect of the cascade or emanation of value into every particular instance that you are a part of. That is what allows you the relevance realization in your salience landscape. And I don't want to sound over Vakian and lose people there. I don't know again if that will make sense. Maybe it's too much, but I think it's important.
Hmm.
And so to answer your question, I do think if we're oriented towards meaning, understood in that way that I was just talking about, I think that that is the best that we can currently do, probably to avoid the kinds of, you could say, seven deadly sins that we were talking about earlier, because
Hmm.
it's inherently relational in the way that we were talking about, right? It is like that's what we would be meaning by God, is the order, the ordering of the passions and the ordering of desire and value. And so I'll put it this way, this might be the easiest way of putting it, right? Like if what causes suffering and the breakdown of value is imbalance, let's just use that term, there are better terms that could be used, let's just say imbalance, right? Then if our goal is balance, then it's hard to see how you could have a negative version of balance. Do you see what I'm saying? There's something about, if you absolutize the relativity of things, then you're kind of at least avoiding the worst pitfalls of that older model. But then, of course, the process continues, and you've got to see how you're actually still dealing with an absolute unfolding. And again, God, I'm so
Hmm.
sorry. I don't know if that it's just, I
Well,
love it. I
let
mean, I
me.
think it's very fascinating, but maybe it's just terribly pedantic and nonsensical to people.
Well,
I don't know.
I think there's a way you can bring the two together. You
Okay.
can find a way to understand it. So let's imagine that there's like a line, and it's like the beginning of a race, and everybody's lined up on this line. Or maybe they're scattered. There's a desert, and it's
Mm-hmm.
almost like a salt flat. They all have their cars, and their destination is a point in infinity on the horizon, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
singular point. And
Mm-hmm.
so they're all going to have their own headings
Yes.
to get
Yes.
there,
Yeah.
and it's going to look different. But
Mm-hmm.
as they approach, it's going to almost be like they're driving parallel
Mm.
because of how close they're getting.
Hmm.
And so once you get to the top, it's you can have the same destination, but you can have different headings in this
Yeah.
sense. And so this is my idea with the saints too. This idea of um, the the brilliant part about the way that it's laid out is that each saint is has their own context, and the way they respond to that context is along the same pattern, but it looks nothing alike at all.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And it's not that everybody acts like Christ exactly, but it's that they're acting in the mode of like how would Jesus have lived in this
Mm.
situation.
Mm.
And so I think that's the proper kind of understanding where
Mm-hmm.
uh, I agree. The order of the priorities is can be all mixed up at the bottom because somebody has no family, then they're not going to prioritize family.
Mm.
But somebody else they might, and then someone else who might be called to a different place, they might prioritize family less because they're doing some other charity work or
Mm-hmm.
whatever in this optimal kind of ordering.
Mm-hmm.
But as you approach the top of the hierarchy, I think there's a lot less shifting.
Yeah.
And then once you reach the top, that's the unified place where it
Yeah.
all meets, and we're all pointed to that. Is at least
Well,
my
here'd be
conception.
my thought on that. I mean, yeah, I like that. And I would say that, to bring this back to so the issue of communion. So the whole idea, right, is that, yeah, is that there is this unity and diversity. There is this one in the many in a kind of meta one that's not non-dual, and there's a Trinitarian, all that stuff, right?
Mhm.
So those are the kind of core dynamics. Now, once you start going down that pyramid, let's say, you're going to find a greater emphasis on the differences. And I think that
Mhm.
there will get tripped up in terms of, again, the misplaced absolute, of like what we're really seeing is, oh, we think that this is the absolute important thing. And to bring back that, what I was saying earlier about communion, right? Some people want to say that what's really important in communion is apparently, like, yeah, the nature of the bread, the theology,
Mhm.
is it transubstantiation, consubstantiation? Did you get confirmed in this church or that church? And if you can't do that together with other people, then you're not really, we're not really part of the same church. And so that, to me, is misplaced absoluteness at the same scale, at the same level of oh, I want to be healthy, so that means I'll do these things and I will wash my hands so many times and this sort of thing, right? That's an orientation towards church. It's an orientation towards communion, but it's actually a rather, and this is going to sound, I don't know, controversial, I guess. I think it's a rather low level resolution on what is being actually called out or called forth from the bigger thing higher up the pyramid, right?
Hmm.
Meaning the irony, right, is that when TLC people come together or any interfaith and ecumenical, cross group communion takes place where people are loving one another and breaking bread together, right? That is communion. And that's communion in a way that's not getting lost or stuck in the particular. It's actually finding what is really truly general and universalizable and unifying, integrating in communion. And so I think that one of the things that metamodern framings call us to try to think more about is like is these ways of thinking, is like how can we see something as more from a meta perspective in a way that includes you know those other things, in the same way that the church can include the Franciscans, but the Franciscans can't include the church, right? That's sort of a
Hmm.
dynamic. Is that yeah, we can, if for those people for whom the specific kind of sacramental Eucharist is really important, that can be a thing. But there's also a way in which that's a kind of invitation to transcend the misplaced absolute of what that is to something more universal and higher. And what that is the direction, is a Christian direction. It's a moving
Hmm.
towards the integration of things while maintaining their particulars. And so, um, yeah.
Well, and one worry I have, and this is kind of a little bit of a pushback, is that sometimes the way that, at least, I don't know, sometimes when people talk about integration, it feels like they're talking about tolerance and this idea
Mm,
that really our differences don't matter,
mm,
that they're just, they're whatever, and we
yeah.
we all have our own way of going about it. And the issue you run in there is like, what's it? It's that there are kind of like points where there's contact and there's friction and there's
Hmm.
tension, and those tensions allow you to communicate and for you to explore deeper
Hmm.
um, into these ideas. And sometimes the reaction is, if there's any tension at all, then that means that this isn't right. And the problem is you only argue about things you care about, and you only care
Mm.
about the most important things. And so, or you should care about
Hmm.
the most important things.
Hmm.
And so, that's why you'll see conflict is there.
Yeah.
Um, and so I don't know.
Yeah.
I
No, I
agree
think
with you in
that's
a lot
right.
of ways, but I think
No, and I think that it's important to raise that because there is this sort of kumbaya pluralism that wants to come out as part of these things of like, hey, yeah, all of our differences are really just superficial, right?
mhm,
And that's not quite right either. Certainly not right. And we want to, and this is the difficult paradox of like, unity and difference, I guess you could say. Um, but one of the things that I think, helps with this issue is to see what really matters at the right level of analysis. Meaning,
mhm,
right? Uh, in a fully relativistic world, you could say, "Hey, you know, I'm a feminist and you're a misogynist, but we can all
yeah.
get along." Or I'm a Jew and you're an anti-Semite or a Nazi, and like, hey, but these are all just superficial differences, right? It's like, no, they're not superficial differences. But what's important, what's different about these differences is that they actually are operating at a level that leads to disunity in a profound sense. And all right, so this is kind of what like it's called the paradox of tolerance. I think was it Karl Popper or was it I think it was Popper, right? It's sort of like if you live in an open society, but then some people in that open society want to use their freedom to try to bring fascism in a closed society, how
Mhm,
do you adjudicate that, right? So that you have to have meta values in an open society that values an open society. And that when the open society is attacked or threatened, then you are intolerant of intolerance, right? That's a
mhm,
necessary boundary condition in order to maintain otherwise a flourishing tolerance. And so Some people might look at that as a sort of paradox, but it's actually, I think, a recognition that there are meta level values that go into things. And now, what's interesting, I guess, is that if your meta level value is things, something like compassion or synthesis, bridge building, etc., right? These sorts of things. Then you can come together, right? But then you're not going to be including Nazis and misogynists and closed-minded people. This is sort of the irony. And so one of the things that we're challenged to do is try to make the most open kind of society and perspective that we can, and that requires meaningfully identifying those things that undermine those values. And I would separate that from kind of the small differences as I see them.
Hmm.
But again, other people look at it differently, right? Where like, you know, uh, let's say, what are the meta values going on in a conversation that's trying to really profoundly adjudicate the theological issue of whether or not bread is changed into the body of Christ or whether it's just a symbol, right? Now, if you want to wind up dividing people and then saying those people are wrong, have it wrong, they're stupid, they're papists, they're, basically not even Christians, blah blah blah. You have divided people along, how would you say? You've divided people ostensibly over communion. And
Hmm.
that is a kind of, that should make us like aware that something's probably wrong here, right? Whereas if you're able to see in communion something bigger that's able to actually more effectively commune people, maybe that's a little bit more oriented towards what these things are doing. I was just talking to who was I talking to a couple minutes ago? Uh, I got it mixed up because I'd forgotten. I got my calendar all mixed up, and so I thought I was going to be talking to you at that point, and it wound up being I was talking to him. Oh, his name is on the tip of my tongue. Noah. No, no.
Noah.
It's you're Noah. Hold on, let me just. I want to get this right because I like to give credit when I'm talking about uh people and conversations that have been had. Ah, I'm totally forgetting. Anyway, we had a wonderful conversation, but we were talking about how if you on this sort of issue, if you wind up dividing people, that there's a sort of small-mindedness that I was trying to make the connection with Paul in where he talks about eating food sacrificed to pagan idols, and
Hmm.
it's sort of like some people in the church were really against doing that and wouldn't do it, and other people were okay with it. And Paul makes the point of like, oh yeah, okay, well, that's a difference. That's a meaningful difference. But like in the language he uses is, basically that like the people who don't want to do it, that's fine. But there are other people who see that it doesn't really matter. And like that's actually kind of what's more important. But the point that he was trying to make in that letter is he says, blessed are those who are not condemned by what they affirm. And that was kind of the main point I was trying to get at here,
Hmm.
was just that there's something that I think even implicit in a lot of the early Christian materials is trying to get us to think more broadly about things and to expand our conception of what a neighbor is, and that some people are going to have a more narrow sense of what really matters, and like that's fine. But then also, blessed are those who like don't sweat the small stuff, right? And so anyway, ramble. His name will come to me. We had a long conversation. It was great. I'll probably post it at some point. But anyway, clearly I'm running out of
Yeah.
steam and I've lost my coherency. So we should probably start to draw this fascinating and wonderful conversation to a close. But I've really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it too. It was great. I think yeah, you're right about it's the negotiation of the essentials. That's been something I've always, not always, but for a long time I've been kind of processing through. As a Protestant, I was living in a house with 10 other Catholic guys, and so um just always debating, or not even
Uh-huh.
debating, but just exploring and having this time of like, oh, like this is something that you find to be really important, and I'd never had thought of. Um, but I think right there too, you're talking about the this weird liminal space between the bottom of your priorities and the middle of someone else's. And
Hmm.
that this kind of mismatch of levels sometimes is reflective of it's not actually there. But I think sometimes is like in Paul's case, where he's kind of talking about how, well, really the priorities should be here, but somebody else has reorganized, and
Mm.
actually the unity is a higher priority than either of these.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to to negotiate those is always really difficult. But
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, it's a
Yeah,
it's a
and I,
task.
I I deal with that in my own way because, it's like a balance of what you want to bring to the conversation. I could spend a lot of my time talking about the historical critical stuff, but that's probably not going to be fully edifying, right? Either. And so, for me, that's like a really important part. But if I just harp on that all the time, it's just going to not it's not going to land, and you're actually going to wind up alienating people, and that's not the impact that you want to have. And so being able to find, yeah, what is essential, what isn't, what orientations really do matter, and what issues are sort of non-negotiable. And like for me, and I think this is hopefully non-negotiable, but it does come down to love, like
Hmm.
if, and of course this obviously you can interpret this, and you can interpret it away, but it's sort of like if Christians aren't being loving, then something's off there, right? And yet at the same time, I think we all have experiences where Christians aren't being very loving, and it's like, well, what's the deal? But again, in the notion of love, is there something that still draws boundaries, right? Like, because if you're not loving, if someone is not loving, then we'd say that's bad. But now we're
Hmm.
saying something's bad, right? And so, but maybe that's one of those meta values where you just have to say, yeah, like we value love, and if so, but then what does love look like, and what's the right kind of, you know how would you say, our culture wants to, I think, tends towards taking down too many boundaries, that we don't often appreciate the value of certain definitions, distinctions, and then the kinds of ways that constraints can actually empower us. And
Hmm.
so we have to get our understanding of love right as well. Love is not to just level everything and then say everybody and everything is welcome all the time, actually. And there's a kind of interesting way that you need to generate constraints in order to be maximally receptive, which is a kind of fascinating thing that also shows up in complexity dynamics as well, that constraints are empowering. And so yeah, I think that then that becomes a really important theological, like a legitimately important theological question, right? Is like, what does really good love look like?
Hmm.
And it's not just it's like, also like with a parent, it's like you don't want to just let your kids run wild, because then you're actually not loving them. But then if
Oh.
you've got to give some tough love, then people are unhappy. So anyway, maybe this sounds trite, but it's like incredibly profound, because I think a lot of people might interpret some of the things I try to articulate in that light. They're like, oh, Brendan's just some crazy liberal progressive person who wants to just, I don't know, open everything up indefinitely, and then what, right?
Hmm.
And like that's a legitimate concern. So we have to be clear about what we mean by these meta values. And then I think that would be a meaningful uh expenditure of the kind of uh precision that theology strives for, right? I would find that a meaningful application of our very precise uh desire for clarity and specificity, whereas I don't find that of value in applications towards like nitty gritty theological, how many hypostases and this and that. It's sort of like, um, I don't think that that's a proper application of that mode of thought. But again, I'm probably rambling.
Sorry, I know I keep pushing it further, but
No, that's fine.
I think that's one of the key parts, because I don't know, I've sat back and not
Luke
kind of
Freeman. Sorry, I'm sorry. The,
Luke
the
Freeman.
name just came to my head. Luke
Okay.
Freeman is who I spoke to earlier. I hate
And
not giving, I don't want to just. So, yeah, Luke, if you're watching, I'm sorry I forgot your name. I hate forgetting people's names. But anyway, terribly interrupted you
no
to
worries,
shout
no.
his name.
But this is I think this is what's meant by God is love. And
Hmm.
it's this, and the reason why I kind of wanted to sit back and maybe not mention it at first is because of the horrible kind of English linguistics around the word love, is that
Yeah,
it's all tied in together. And
yeah.
I don't think, because some people will look at that depending on how their theology of scripture is, and they'll
Mm-hmm.
look at that as a redefinition, that this is now a new changing and a new understanding.
Mm.
And I think a lot of that comes out of historical critical that lens and seeing like, oh, there's a development here.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas I think I tend to, not out of like disrespect for historical criticism. I think that the that you're missing something if you're only looking at it one way. You have to
Yeah.
look at it the other way and to see, well, okay, so John points it out here this way. And so how do we reread all of this in the context of this is this identification that John has made? And I think that's the key to understanding this kind of mythos is that um, love does not look like, all cuddles and rainbows.
Hmm.
That there's a gritty and sometimes just like a brutal aspect to love.
Hmm.
And that's where if I was going to bring it back, I think you actually would find a lot that interesting in Nick Cave because
Hmm.
he's kind of exploring some of this too. Um, I'm gonna go back because why not? But he started a punk band back in the day, and it's called The Birthday Party, and I think he had some other ones, but
Great name.
and he well whenever he talks about it because it's so like dramatic like that they'll say like what happened with the birthday party, and I always heard that and I was like there's like some like tragic event that happened or
Mm.
something
Hmm.
the way they talk about it. But it was very intense, like it was to the point where like he would be on stage and he would hit people with a microphone stand and people would like leave like with like gashes on their head.
Wow.
And do you know the Andromedist, Burn Power?
Mm-mm.
He makes videos around here. He actually went to one of their concerts, or one of his friends did, and so he has a firsthand account of these events that go on. But anyway, he moves out of this, and then he's kind of at the time all through his life he's reading the Bible, but he's kind of going through each of his albums are kind of um a new bit that he's like integrating, and so he's also
Mm.
integrating types of music into. There's a point where he's kind of going down the route of sea shanties to um, old American like blues, and it's just fascinating. But his
Mm.
one of his newer songs is called Wild God, about this
That
this
sounds
god that's
familiar.
flying around, and
Hmm.
I don't know. I think there's plenty of stuff there that you could work on, and I think it would be really fun. But
Yeah. No,
yeah.
I think yeah. I mean, again, this could then launch us into a whole new thing, but just briefly to touch on some of that. Like I agree, and then we have to think about what we mean again by love and all that.
Hmm.
And you mentioned the paucity, or the failure of English to with that word, right? There's philos, there's eros, there's agape. And I think that there's also, again, with the whole balance issue, I think Nietzsche does a great critique of a lot of the Christian tradition relative to a specific kind of agape love and not integrating enough of like erotic love, or philos love, the love of friendship in these things. And there's different kinds of love, and there might even be a meta love. Sorry, everyone, with the
Well,
meta stuff, but like
and
something that kind of holds these together. Yeah, go on.
that's been brought up recently. I can't remember who for the life of me said it. Someone said something along the lines of like a true understanding of love isn't only the agape. Like it's
Hmm.
not just that. It
Hmm.
is there's this idea of that God is also what you ultimately desire. And so there is an eros to it.
Yeah,
And there is a phileo understanding of
yeah,
of this love that comes in too. And so it's the love that combines all the pieces too.
yeah, yeah. I like, well, that's, and bringing it all back to Dante, the love that moves the sun and the other stars, but that's, Dante has this beautiful image. Oh, Dante. Oh man. If people just get one thing, just go read Dante, especially
Mhm.
the Paradiso. But he has this beautiful image about the book of the Sibyl's prophecies, the leaves of her book. And there's a story, I think it's in Virgil, where, the Sibyl, who, right, is like having these exotic kind of, we now know, kind of like weird toxin infused visions and causing her to like see these things and make prophecies and oracles and stuff. She'll like write them down, but then as soon as she writes one down, it'll scatter off, right? She's not keeping any of this together. Everything's all fragmented all over the place. And Dante has this vision of, well, right, there's implicit here, like this notion that like this profound insight, right? This like inspiration is like being chaotically expressed and then just scattered. And Dante has this image of when he reaches sort of the summum bonum, the center of the Empyrean, and everything coming together. It's like as though all of the leaves of the Sibyl's book are gathered into one volume, right? It's this bringing together of all things. And I wanted to make that point earlier at some point where the whole image of the Empyrean and the kind of kaleidoscopic swirling into the center is the mandala that also that Jung talks about as being the archetype both of the self and of God, and that at the center is the unity, and at the periphery is the plurality, and the center sort of holds together all of the difference. So you get the one and the many combined in the center, and that somehow all these things are held together. And I think that holding together, that calling together, summoning together, is the love, the meta love. It's both eros, things coming together, in both sexual but also other forms of just unification, but then also the wanting to bridge and gather into a sort of integrative, healthy collective, those across differences, maybe those who are suffering. And so there's compassion, and that's that agape of wanting to help out, help your neighbor who's suffering, and to empathize, and to take pity, as it were, on someone, and kind of help lift them up. And then the friendship and the philos, and there are many other kinds of love, but they all seem to be united in the sense of things coming together in their difference to generate a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts, which
Hmm.
again is the notion that I think of as God as being, God as emergent potential or surplus cohesion, and all that. And so yeah, that's why I find the image of the Empyrean a wonderful icon for God, and I think that there's something profoundly true to that symbol. And so that's why I'd love to have it on a desert island
Yeah.
if I needed to. But
I
anyway,
think, oh, sorry, I know you're wanting to
no,
land the
no,
plane
no,
and I
no.
keep
Sum it
stopping
up.
you. But I think there is a way in which I might see it flipped, right?
Hmm.
That it's not emergent, it's top down. And I think
Hmm.
that's the major difference is that it's not something that we're bringing together and it's pulling us up like a
Hmm.
balloon, but it is like the sun, like it's calling and
Yep.
it's bringing us closer to whatever extent
Yep.
that
No, and
analogy makes sense.
there's
The
emergence
gravity of
in
it.
emanation, and
Yeah.
and Vervaeke talks about this, drawing on the Neoplatonic stuff, but then bridging that with kind of complexity sciences, that there's top down and bottom up kind of causation, and there is this sort of total wholeness to the whole thing, um, and yeah, there's a sort of something that we're moving into and towards that clearly has to exist in a kind of sense for us to move towards it, and yet we have to also actualize that. But anyway, no, I think that's an important point for sure.
Well, thank you again for taking the time to talk and
Hey man,
go
that
through
was
this.
great. I love this. Good stuff. I really enjoyed talking to you. You're incredibly bright, and I appreciate, your wealth of knowledge. And I love that poem that you read. I was really moved by that. And I'll send you a copy of the full God poem if you're interested,
That'd be
because
great.
I think you might find some really interesting things there. And I'm gonna try to. You've also inspired me to do something more with some of the scenes in this book that will try to make that a little bit more accessible to people, because it's there's a lot to all that. But anyway, this is
Yeah.
wonderful. Loved it. Do it again sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to. I didn't even get through all my questions, so that's
Cool.
great.
Well, awesome. All right. Well, Godspeed, my friend.
No,
Till next time.
no, thank you. Have a great one.
Bye.
Bye.